Thanks for joining us for this recording of our webinar, Cybersecurity Threat Management During a Global Disruption like the COVID-19 Pandemic. I'm Todd Schwartz, Executive Director of the Cincinnati chapter of the European American Chamber of Commerce. And this event is presented by the EACC's network of chapters across Europe and the United States. This webinar features the insight and expertise of our panelists, Nicolas Arpagian, the Vice President for Strategy and Public Affairs with Orange Cyber Defense, Ashley Hurst, a partner and the International Sector Leader for Tech, Media, and Communications at OSBORNE CLARKE, Robert Gardner, the founding member of New World Technology, and James Walker, a partner with Richard's KIBBE ORBE. Unfortunately, there was a problem with the recording of this webinar, and we lost about the first 10 minutes of the event. My colleague, Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild, Executive Director of the EAC's chapter in New York, offered brief welcoming remarks and noted that planning for this event had begun before the pandemic had hit. We were able to pivot and redirect the topic to address the increased cyber risks that a dispersed workforce connecting from homes are creating. James Walker asked participants to respond to a quick poll, and more than 7 out of 10 respondents indicated they'd never been the victim of a cyber attack either before or during the crisis, although over 60% said they did recognize phishing and other attempted attacks. When James asked Bob Gardner to comment on the poll results, Bob noted that a better question would have been, do you recognize that you've been attacked? Because it's almost a certainty that everyone has been hacked at one point or another, whether we recognize it or not. He pointed out that even before the crisis, adversaries were growing in number and ability, and also in their targeting, from efforts to access your personal information, to trying to steal corporate secrets, to holding data for ransom, and even to manipulate and place stock in other markets as a way to generate funds to finance and expand their operations. Bob and then Ashley Hurst both noted that the current work environment, with users now connecting to their workplaces from home systems over unsecured networks and probably with poor hygiene habits like weak passwords, was making the situation only more dire. Ashley underscored that some of the solutions remained the most basic, from enforcing strong password policies among employees to ensuring IT staffs are encrypting data. But imposing such rules in the current environment can be challenging. James underscored that the risks businesses faced related to these issues are immense, not just to operations, but also the legal risks. And that's where our recording picks up, with Nicolas Arpagian responding to a question about the links between the technology and the legal implications, particularly related to the regulatory environments on both sides of the Atlantic.
The tech guys have to talk with the legal teams because the law, the contracts, some specific vertical legislation will impose criteria of cybersecurity concerning what are the data that has to be protected, what are the declaration or when some data are stolen or are hacked by someone or are not available anymore. And the fact is, by law or by contract, they have to be able to give to proofs of their capacity to protect the assets and that they did everything they could to avoid situation. For instance, in France and in Europe, we have a legislation that described critical infrastructures, essential services. By law, you are appointed as a provider of essential services, and then you must prove that you get a proper level of cybersecurity for your equipment, for the capacity to take back control in case of attack, and the fact that you invested in your human technical capacity to increase and improve your security level. So it's a question of, obviously, it's not only a question of technology, it's a question where we need to have the guys from the production team, the legal and the lawyers that are involved, and sometimes the choice to say, okay, I don't choose that technical solution, even if it's efficient or it's affordable, it's cheap, or it's free of it's not so expensive to use it, but because I have the impact is so important if we have to consider the cybersecurity criteria. So the big advantage of having legislation dedicated to cybersecurity in that case, okay, it's force in a way business leaders to take care of that subject and to consider that subject. First of all, that put an agenda on that question, saying, okay, you must enforce that legislation by that precise date. So it forced the team to respect the proper timing of that organization. And most of the time there are potentially some fines if you are your responsibility, you are considered as responsible in case of loss of or hack of information. And the fact that, for instance, we have the case of the GDPR, which is a European legislation that gives some important fines considering the protection in case of loss of personal data. And it's one way to put a price on the question of cybersecurity, because if you know that you will have to maybe to pay a fine at the end, it's a good point for board members to say, okay, we have to be to invest and to be at the proper level on that field. And last point, to say legislation is very important, because we see in due diligences in the stock markets, most of the investors are now asking for, okay, are you prepared? What did you do to just in case of cyber attack? So obviously, it's not only a question of a technology of the CISO team. It's obviously a very transversal subject today.
So, Ashley, do you want to tell us what's new in the UK?
Yeah. In terms of dealing with cyber attacks and data breaches, there's not a great deal that is new, because the regime is still governed by two key pieces of legislation, which is the GDPR and the 28 pieces of local legislation which implement the GDPR across Europe. And then there's the Network and Information Systems Directive, which is not so much concerned with personal data as concerned with critical infrastructure system, telecoms, energy companies, etc. And if you boil all that down, they are concerned with two principal things. Firstly, the security that you have in place, and the phrase we keep hearing is appropriate technical and organizational measures. That's a phrase that appears in both of those two key pieces of legislation. And the second is, if you have an incident, who do you tell and when? And in relation to personal data in the GDPR, there's that famous 72-hour window to tell regulators, and then there's as soon as reasonably practicable window to tell any individuals affected. And those time frames for notifying, and often you'll have an incident which concerns both pieces of legislation, that 72-hour period really crunches decision making, because if you tell a regulator, often the regulator wants to know who else you're going to tell, and if you tell other people, then you need to have a media strategy and a defense strategy and all the rest of it. So in terms of what's new, it's not new legislation, but we are now getting to the stage, 2 years in, where we're starting to see the practical application of it. So what do regulators understand by the phrase appropriate technical and organizational measures? What will they do if you don't quite meet the 72-hour window? What's their expectation in terms of how much they want to be kept informed if you're dealing with a cyber attack? And then on an enforcement perspective, when will they take action and when will they not? And that's the big question for the clients. And I think we'll start to see this across Europe. And that really focuses the minds of security experts, because the costs of these incidents are rising. It's not just a case of fixing it and moving on. There's now a longer tail for the bigger incidents.
So I just want to talk about a couple of things that are happening in the U.S. And they're from completely different angles. One, if you look at what the SEC is doing with respect to the regulation of public companies, so the SEC has its safeguards rule, which essentially requires that companies implement appropriate procedures to mitigate the likelihood of any sort of breach or interference with personal information, company information, etc. Any information that should be confidential. And it will penalize companies heavily where it finds that the policies and procedures aren't up to snuff. While we haven't seen new cases arising under the safeguards rule, what the SEC has been doing is monitoring all the companies that have been touting COVID-19 related products, COVID-19 treatments, the manufacture of PPE, the personal protective equipment, temperature equipment, testing kits, all of that, because there's been a real rash of companies, or maybe fake companies, that are touting all sorts of solutions and equipment, and the information is highly questionable, the trading is highly questionable, and so the SEC has just stopped trading. It has the ability to do that. It's implemented that in many instances, and that's been effective to sort of, put a clamp down on that. The other thing that's been sort of interesting is, we don't have the developed data privacy in the U.S., although now we are having to adjust to the GDPR. But California has implemented its California Consumer Privacy Act, which gives individuals some sort of control over preventing the sale of their personal information, a right to review, and various other rights that haven't previously existed. That's flying right in the face, enforcement of that act is flying right in the face of various sorts of monitoring applications that companies are wanting to implement with people working remotely. Information that talks about that gives data from mobile devices to evaluate whether people are social distancing. Data from 23andMe and similar products analyzing customer DNA to see if their genes are susceptible to COVID-19. Information about temperatures through these interconnected thermometers. All these equipment are very much impinging on this notion of personal information and violation of those rights. And so what's happened is that you have industries that are rising up and saying, well, let's hold off on enforcing the California Consumer Privacy Act because we want the ability to use this sort of equipment. So that's been an interesting tension. There's a question here that before, Nicola, I'm going to move to you, but before we do that, Bob, I'm just curious if you have any response to this. Any thoughts on the vulnerability posed by using home devices like Alexa or Google or other ambient devices?
Well, yeah, there are a couple of levels of vulnerability. Actually, one of them that people tend to overlook is now that home computers are an extension of office computers, the platforms and mostly the users have a problem bouncing back and forth between the Mac world and the PC world, or the Windows world and the iOS world, which is adding a big vulnerability to the whole circumstance. That's sort of one of the biggest things that we're seeing now.
In that case, it's not so much a question of vulnerability. The difficulty with these bots is the trust that you have that when the microphone is off, it's really off. And obviously, we had some cases where the microphone was still working when the people in the room thought it was off. And the idea is that obviously to teach that artificial intelligence or that machine learning, which is behind these bots, obviously they need to take information, to take the sound of your voice, to take your center of interest. So it's more a question of confidence that you have in the capacity of the bot to be effective, to be switched off once you want it, than a question of hacking. Obviously, it's a device which is connected. So as a connected device, it can represent an open gate to your information system if that bot is connected to other tools like the home or like the personal computer with personal data. So obviously these products have to be sold to be connected, to be open, and it can represent, and we had cases, or it was used to enter the home information system. So it's obviously not a risk, but something, a potential gate into your IT intimacy.
Now, Nicola, if you want to continue to talk about what people should do on both sides of the Atlantic to mitigate attacks, that's sort of the next area we want to talk about, prevention and management.
The capacity, obviously, I think there are a few words that you have to keep in mind. First of all, it's information. Information, that means that if we are talking about businesses, about companies, obviously a large audience have to be absolutely sure that the question of cybersecurity is not only the job of the IT security team. Why? Because as far most of the time, that's only few people, when there are few people dedicated to that activity. So it means that everyone who is connected has to be fully conscious that she is part of the global security, because they click on a link or they download a file, and so it means that they can alert and do something. So first of all is to say, okay, by delivering information, to be sure that everyone is conscious about that responsibility by using IT tools. Second point is training. It's like when they are the fire alarm, and you know that when the alarm is running, that you have to leave the building, you have to take your clothes, you have some behaviors that were taught. In the same case, when you have some doubts, you have to know what to do, because in that case, the time, the agenda, the timing is very important to say, we will be able to recover, to help. It will be easier to recover if that's done soon, if that's done without any delay. Third point is, okay, they need to have procedures. I know what to do. I know, for instance, I know that I have to disconnect the network. I have to keep the electricity on my computer, not to switch off, because I'm not sure that it will start again if I switch it off. I need to know the phone number of the guy who is in charge of cybersecurity. Procedures, because the time is very expensive in these circumstances. So the attacks is most of the time you have to keep in mind that when the screen is fully blank or fully and you can't use your computer anymore, there are no doubt that there is an attack. But most of the time, some attacks are using a part of the capacity, of technical capacity of your computer, of your data centers, or it can be by stealing information without disturbing your organization. So it's not only an attack which is visible with no doubt that, okay, I'm under attack. You have a large number of categories of attacks which are very efficient, that can be very costful and expensive for the company or for your personal, for individuals. But to see that, okay, if I'm trained, if I'm aware of that, I will be part of the answer, the part of the solution. So the question is to mitigate, invest in the capacity of detection to be sure that, okay, if something wrong happened, I can't avoid to have that attack. But if I detect it quite soon, I will be, it's like in the forest when you have a big start of a fire. If you are here, you just have the water enough close to the start of the fire, you can stop it in a short period of time without being a professional fireman. Obviously, if it takes so long because you don't have water, you didn't detect the start, but that's exactly the same considering the IT system in cybersecurity.
I don't know, Ashley, if you want to talk about crisis management?
Yeah, just a quick sort of point on that sort of mitigation thing first. A lot of people say it's inevitable, you're going to get attacked, and therefore you need to be ready when you do. And I think a lot of the incidents that we've seen recently, particularly sort of malware, ransomware attacks, could have been prevented at any of a number of different stages. And I think it's helpful for companies to understand the anatomy of a ransom attack and work out the various different stages of it. So usually the attackers need a way in. Often companies are a victim not because they're targeted, but because they have some database which is exposed to internet scanning tools. And so when attackers are searching the internet for a victim, they pop up. And that's the start of it. So if they haven't applied the correct settings to databases such that they are not publicly facing when they don't need to be, that's an easy answer. And so making sure, and of course every company has policies and protocols, or big companies do, around this, but it's making sure they're actually implemented for all databases and ensuring that when you're pen testing, that where you're looking out for those perimeter vulnerabilities. Then, once attackers get in on the outside, they don't just get straight to the crown jewels. Usually they have to crack some kind of password to get into systems, actually to get to data and leave ransom attack. And so that's about internal controls. It's usually about password protocols, making sure that admin credentials are absolutely kept sacrosanct, changed on a regular basis, complex password. This is kind of basic stuff, which we see continually being overlooked, and default passwords for certain software systems being used because people didn't quite realize a database was going to be used for a particular purpose, for example. And then once the attackers are in, they've got the credentials, they're into the system. Have you got any monitoring systems that will detect it or that would stop large data flows going out? Often ransom attacks now are not just about encrypting systems, but the attackers like to steal data because they can use that for extra leverage to try to get you to pay. So have you got detection systems that would stop large outflows of data and quickly? If they do manage to obtain data, they often do. Is it encrypted? Often the impact of a breach or an attack is going to be much lower if you've actually encrypted the data properly and you've got the most up-to-date form of encryption for passwords in particular. And then if that all else fails, then you're into the response stage. How quickly can you respond? And have you got the right team and all the rest of it? So I think there is that sort of preparatory stage, which can sometimes be overlooked. In terms of crisis, to answer your question, to me, just the key is it's no good relying on your crisis plans and your paper. I can't remember the last incident that I've managed where somebody has said, here's our plan, go, follow it. It doesn't happen. They are useful in their preparation and they're useful as a guideline, but you very, very quickly move away from those documents into making critical decisions under pressure. And making critical decisions under pressure, you're only as good as the people around the table and the information that they've got. And so sharing of facts, maintaining the facts, constant updating, making sure that you're having regular calls at the right times, you don't spend too much time on calls. All of this is basic stuff that needs to be thought about and practiced. And then just finally, once you've got your key information, is how do you actually make a critical decision? Do you pay a ransom? Do you notify the public? And do you tell a regulator? What do you tell a regulator? Sometimes these are really critical decisions that you have to make in a short space of time. Are you going to do that by just having a general board discussion? Or are you going to think about some structure and methodology? And you can learn a lot from the military as to how they make critical decisions by thinking about different scenarios, seeing them through to their conclusion before making a decision, thinking about the worst case scenario, the likely scenario, and the best case scenario, and really thinking through every one before you actually apply your gut instinct. So that's the key. Clear facts and controlled decision making under pressure.
So I'm going to turn to Bob in a minute, but the one thing I wanted to emphasize that Ashley just said is that, look, it's important to have, it's helpful to have a plan. Obviously, each situation is different, and so you end up not necessarily following the plan rotely. But it is important to consider practice, and you made this point, practice in the context of working remotely, just to make sure that you have the ability to quickly, contact the people that you need to contact, given that they're not necessarily in an office or responding to an office number or whatever the situation is, so that you can get the various pieces of your program in place and you can make, speak to the people you need to speak to and get the information you need to gather in as efficient a matter as possible, even with everyone working remotely. So Bob, I'm going to turn it over to you to either comment on that or to segue into what we need to do. Maybe you just want to sort of tackle both.
Thank you. A couple of things, just to go back to the crisis management and even before that, mitigating attacks. Let's understand that cybersecurity, unlike a lot of the other things that threaten companies and nations and individuals, suffers from the fact that there is no certain attribution. So you cannot be sure when something happens, even if you're able to detect it, where it came from and who did it with certainty. And therefore, there is a very weak deterrence paradigm. That being the case, if you say that we can't deter it, and especially during something like a pandemic when the frequency of attacks is expanding and the number of vulnerabilities are so large, this whole idea that we are going to solve our problem by just managing attacks and fixing vulnerabilities is not viable. There's too much, you cannot do it. What you have to start doing is thinking about the enterprise consequences. The idea today is not stop it, not even really focus too much on mitigating it, but focus on surviving it. How do you survive it? You can't survive it unless you know what are the big enterprise consequences that can visit you, and measuring, quantifying what is the extent of that impact, and then allocating your resources, which are scarce, to those high impact enterprise consequences first. We have to abandon the idea that all of our cybersecurity is about watching attacks and vulnerabilities and start putting more of our attention on understanding the big consequences, things for a corporation, for example, that hit the three financial statements, hit stock value and volatility, hit reputation, measuring them and focusing resources on that, what they used to call a business back security paradigm. This is what enterprise risk management is all about. If we don't bring cybersecurity squarely into the practice of enterprise risk management, we will never catch up. We'll always be behind the curve. So all of those things, whether it's in managing the crisis or even preparing ahead of time for before the crisis as to where your resources go, we have to start thinking enterprise risk business back first. We have to move the biggest focus from the wiring closet or the data center right squarely back into the boardroom. That's part one. Then going into the next part of your question, the next section starts with a question about keeping cybersecurity teams informed and engaged. We also have to keep not only our business partners, but we have to keep our relative and appropriate enforcement agencies and bodies informed. In the US, that means keep Homeland Security and FBI in your conversations as you move along, and especially if you have upcoming large enterprise events. Similarly with Interpol. So you have to make sure that our teams are not just our people, but our partners and our law enforcement communities and our national organizations and agencies. They're all part of the same community that has to be aware of what has happened, what's going on now, and what you're going to be doing in the future that will invite cyber attention.
Ashley, I don't know if you have any comments you want to add at this point.
No, not at this point.
Okay. Well then, Nicola, I'm going to turn to you.
Yes, obviously in that idea is to say that it's, as I said, it's a question of IT, of technical choices, but very rapidly we will see that we will need to add some competencies concerning communication, concerning legal points and legal responsibility, the HR, because the fact to say, okay, we have to send messages to the teams, for instance, in case of crisis, when the people are working remotely, to say, okay, stop to use your computer, and then by sending them SMS to be sure that they will not open their computer because they will be infected in case they do it. So to be sure that it can't be only dealt by a small team specialized in cybersecurity. So the question of, okay, how we can add the competencies, because everyone will be concerned. And exactly as Bob talked about community, saying, okay, keep in mind the question of subcontractors, because most of the time when you are working for a big firm, big transnational firms, most of the time the hackers, when they want to enter these information systems, they don't choose the big one, which is maybe more structured, more equipped, and has more important capacity to defend itself, but to enter subcontractors, small, medium-sized enterprises, which are technically connected because they are in charge of dealing the heater of the building, or they are in charge of specific activity for their big customers. But obviously the fact the hacker is using these interconnections, and then to understand, to have the clearest view about who is connected to whom to do what, and it will be very important to have that capacity. We talked about a plan. We used to say in France that in case of war, the first victim is the plan, because everything is done outside the plan. So obviously, but in that case, we see that because we learned, because we were trained, it's the best condition for everyone to say, okay, maybe I don't face a situation that are written in the books, but I have the capacity to be out of this situation in good conditions, because I was trained and I know I faced in the past such situation, maybe not for real, but sometimes in training sessions. But okay, I feel more confident when I know that okay, I have colleagues that can help. I have partners and suppliers that can help, and to see that okay, I'm not alone, because keep in mind that the hacker has the choice of the target, has the choice of the agenda, has the choice of the tools he or she.
So Nicola is frozen for a moment. So one thing I'd sort of throw out to the panel, and I'm just curious as to everyone's thoughts.
They can feel fragile in these circumstances.
Okay, Nicola, you were frozen for a minute, so we lost a little bit of what you said, but once you pick up where you were.
Exactly as I said, just to repeat, summarize, is to say we need to have the guys sometimes when the people obviously during the lockdown, and I hope that we will not have to face this situation for too long, and not to start again in the coming future, but to say that people are, as far as they are alone, they can have the feeling not to have the full capacity to act. So more they are connected to others, and knowing that they will be able to face and to cope with that situation, they will be stronger facing these situations where the hacker is choosing the targets, choosing the way of hacking, and choosing the agenda, sometimes stopping its attack and restarting a few hours later. So you have to consider during the crisis that it's never a very constant trip. It's always with up and down, and so that's why we have to be physically and psychologically prepared to face such a situation.
Bob, I'm going to throw this question to you. One thing I wonder is that with workforces working remotely, does that mean that there needs to be some emphasis on training, really retraining or reminding or refreshing everyone's recollection of, how everybody has a role in sort of keeping, becoming susceptible to various sorts of malware and phishing attacks. Is that helpful in this sort of environment, and is it effective to try to do that?
Well, the first thing is, how practical is it when we've doubled and tripled our people and platforms and apps that are all of a sudden part of our cyber ecosystem? How practical is it to have a massive training and awareness program? Yes, it would be wonderful to have, but let's talk about what you actually can do. You have to go back to some very, very basics. And there are only a few things, if it's done well and uniformly, that will have the biggest impact on safeguarding the circumstance. I mean, if we go back to the most basic hygiene, is going to be password management and patch management. If you don't do anything else, but you do that diligently, and everyone does that diligently, then you've made a big dent in it. If, as I said before, if the whole system has more of a focus on the end consequences and puts a lot of the training and focus on knowing what those are and making sure that we allocate resources and attention on those, we don't want to dissipate our attention on vulnerabilities that may be high frequency but low impact because we really don't understand the impact. So we need to train our board members and our executives how to quantify what is the real enterprise impact so that we know where to triage the limited resources that we have. So on the lower end, we need to have the better hygiene with just a few basics. On the high end, we need to understand what are the big assets that need to be protected, even if some of the other ones that we've let pass. And sort of surrounding the problem from those two sides has at least the benefit of being practical and doable.
Sorry, I do want to direct a question to Ashley because I know that you have sort of constant experience with sort of crisis events. We have a question about thoughts on vulnerabilities and risk management for smaller companies versus larger and more global corporations. Any thoughts about that, either based on past or recent experience?
Yeah, well, I think, come back to what I said earlier about the standard is appropriate technical and organizational measures. So that takes into account the stage that a company is at and the type of business it is. And it's for each business to determine what is appropriate. That's a hugely broad question, but to sort of drill down a little bit, what you've got to think about in these, a bit like Bob was saying, sometimes these things are going to happen. The companies with the best systems in the world, the best cyber defenses, the best crisis plans will still suffer cyber attacks. What is often important is to think about what is your story going to be if you're the victim of this attack. Even if you're unlucky, can you turn around and say, we tried to do the right thing? We had a system of technical controls in place. We regularly updated it. We did our pen testing. On the organizational side, we did regular training. We thought about remote working and its impact, and we changed our policies. It wasn't good enough, but we tried. And how are you going to be able to tell that story articulately and what's right for your company? Divide it between technical and organizational and prioritize as to the lowest hanging fruit. You might want to move to a new IT system. It's going to be very expensive. And that might be the overall solution. But in the meantime, make sure you've got your basic password protocol correct. Make sure that you identify that you're not having any databases that are facing the public that don't need to be. And make sure that all your, especially your IT staff, have gone through the compliance protocols and training. There are many easy wins, and record them and put them in a place where you can quickly tell that story, whether you have to do that to investors, to regulators, to customers, whoever. Think about what that story is for your company.
It is a hugely broad question, but at the same time, there is some notion that there are differences. But Bob, one thing I want to throw to you and or possibly to Nicola, whoever would like, is what about international coordination? What do we need to consider there?
Well, there are two levels of international coordination that I think we're falling behind on. The first is that we have this phenomenal scrum of regulations and best practices that are different, not only from country to country and continent to continent, but even within the US. We have industry regs, we have state regs, we have federal regs that are not aligned and that compete with one another. There are overlaps, there are gaps, there are competitions. And that's exacerbated when we go between the US and EU, for instance. GDPR says one thing, NIST says another thing. And we have, companies are a little bit confused about, do they have to do everything? Do they have to spend the money and the time and the people to comply with everything that moves? Or isn't there something that they can do to help coordinate them so they have one view of compliance on an international scale? We haven't done that very well. We have let all of these competing regulations and best practices continue to compete. On the other side, what we have to also do is, back to the issue of being prepared and informing everyone, we also need to coordinate, again, not only with the law enforcement groups from one country to another or one continent to another, but also with the trade groups. And one of the problems that at the same time as we have this healthcare pandemic crisis, we also have a global geopolitical alliance crisis. And that has exacerbated the whole problem, because that used to be a good place to coordinate information, especially about nation-state-based cyber attacks. So the fray to things like NATO and other alliances that's happening on its own has made it harder to take advantage of those alliances and those connections for international coordination on cyber risk, especially when it comes to a bit of attribution and a bit of retribution. So the uncoordinated problem with compliance and the sort of a difficult scrum we have with the alliances that both could be more helpful that aren't, is a place to focus our attention.
I would say that certainly the cooperation that happens through the ACC is something that we can look to as an example. It's probably time for us to wrap up. Todd, I'm going to throw it back to you.
Thanks, James, and thanks so much for your leadership today. So it has come to the top of the hour. That concludes today's webinar entitled Cybersecurity Threat Management During a Global Disruption Like the COVID-19 Pandemic. Thanks to our presenters, Nicholas Arpagian, Bob Gardner, Ashley Hurst, and Jim Walker for sharing their experience and insight. And thanks to all of you for joining us for today's discussion. Just a reminder, all comments and opinions expressed by our speakers today are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the European American Chamber of Commerce or its members. Please stay in touch with your local chapter of the European American Chamber of Commerce for information on upcoming events and webinars, and also be sure to look for a recording of this and other EACC webinars and events on our YouTube channel. Farewell.